That year, around the summer of 2009, the story happened to Yang's family. He was about 8 years old at the time, and on the occasion of the holiday, Yang's family decided to return to their hometown for a few days. It was Yang's first trip out of town, and he was very excited because it was in the countryside, far from the city, and convenient for visiting his grandparents' graves. Walked a little further from the bus station through some houses to reach the grandparents' house because no one had lived there in a long time. The Yang family had to clean up as soon as they arrived. After a long day of work, it was already dark when the three of them sat around the dining table. However, Yan acted strangely during the meal. He was looking out the door and smiling while eating, which drew Yang's mother's attention. She also looked out the door, but there was no one in the yard. But Yang kept looking at the door, then talked as if he was joking with his friends. He turned his face outside and howled loudly that they should wait until he finished eating before going outside to play, which made Yang's mother felt even stranger. Yang quickly let go of his chopsticks when he'd just eaten a little bit, wanted to go out and play with his friends. Yang's mother didn't think much at the time as she thought that he was just a playful boy, so he did it on purpose to make them allow him to go out to play. And she also gently told Yang that he had just arrived here for the first time. How come he had any friends? But Yang insisted, pointing to the yard and saying that some friends were standing outside calling him out to play with them for a while already. When Yang's father heard that, he became concerned. He assumed that because he was tired from the long journey, he had become ill or developed a fever. But no matter how he explained, no one could see the three spirits outside, waving to Yang. They were also children, about Yang's age, 2 boys and 1 girl, with very happy faces but pale skin, and they were constantly inviting him to go out and play with them. Yang was just a kid, so he didn't think much about ghosts or humans when he saw friends waving at him, so he raised his hand, smiled, and waved back. At this point, Yang's parents were very concerned, looked at the door in the direction Yang waved, but they couldn't see anyone. Yang's father was worried that his son would have developed a fever, so he'd instructed his wife to check his temperature. The wife checked hastily, thinking her son was ill, but after a while Yang's body was completely normal, with no fever or anything. Seeing this, Yang's father believed that his son was mischievous, so he asked Yang to go to bed early. He'd been traveling all day, so he obeyed his father and went to bed. Yang planned to go out tomorrow afternoon to play with her friends, so the entire family quickly cleaned up and went to bed early. Around midnight, there was a sound of children laughing and whispering outside the windows, as if they were calling someone. Yang's father was too tired today, so he didn't react. He couldn't hear the sound at all. Yang's mother, on the other hand, was more sensitive. The noise was minor, but it woke her up. The first thing Yang's mother noticed when she opened her eyes was that Yang had disappeared, and she had no idea where or when he had left the bed. Normally, when they traveled or went to strange places, Yang would also wake up his mother to take him to the toilet. She became concerned and got out of bed to go find Yang. As she passed by the window, she heard children's laughter that sounded very similar to Yang's, so Yang's mother went out to look out the window. Went to the window, looked out at the yard. She planned to open the glass windows to take a look around. However, before she could open the glass, the terrifying sight caused her to scream in terror. Yang was clearly visible at this point, sitting under a tree in the yard, playing with the ground and surrounded by 3 other children. Yang, on the other hand, sat on the ground, his hands constantly digging for something, and his expression was very strange. The mother was so terrified that she could only scream, which woke Yang's father up. The children outside in the yard heard Yang's mother's voice and turned to look at her through the window. Their eyes were white with no irises. Their mouths had a devilish smile, and Yang appeared to have missed his mother's voice. They immediately became enraged when they noticed Yang's mother standing at the window and spotted them. They didn't want others to bother Yang, and they seemed to have manipulated Yang into doing something. Yang looked like a lost soul right now. Yang's father also jumped out of bed to rush to his wife's aid. He still had no idea what was going on. Yang's mother was so terrified that she nearly fainted. After assisting his wife, he also looked out the window to see what was happening to her. Yang's father was a man who had served in the army. Seeing his son surrounded by ghostly children, he stormed the door and went out into the yard. The children slowly dispersed as Yang's father approached, and Yang was still digging in the ground with his hands. The three spirits did not forget to leave a ghostly smile before disappearing. Their shapes also became devilishly twisted and vanished. He went to the tree where Yang was sitting and called out for him, but he didn't respond. When he saw that, he hastily lifted Yang up. Yang's body had just seemed to melt, with no resistance at all. His hands remained clutching the dirt below until his father lifted him up. He refused to let go. Both his hands, feet, and his clothes were soiled. His face was white, his mouth was still wet with saliva. His eyes were open, but he appeared to be sleeping, like a sleepwalker. Yang's father shook him constantly, fearful that something would happen to his son, and kept telling him to wake up. Fortunately, Yang's expression began to change after a while, and his eyes were no longer wide open. Yang's fingernails were painful because he had been digging in the ground with his bare hands for a long time. Yang burst into tears after regaining consciousness. Yang's parents escorted him to his room, cleaned the dirt for him, and cleaned the wound to prevent infection. Yang's father then inquired as to what had occurred earlier and why Yang had gone out to the yard. Yang whimpered about everything, even though he was afraid his parents would scold him. He was awakened in the middle of the night by the children's laughter, so he looked outside to see what was going on. Outside the window at the time, Yang noticed 3 children waving to him, accompanied by happy laughter, calling Yang to come play with them. Yang realized they were 3 children whom he had seen while having dinner. Yang was too young. He had no doubts when he jumped out of bed to go out. Yang opened the door and looked around for them. After all, they were all children, so it was understandable that they wanted to play. Yang noticed a large tree in the yard with silhouettes of children in the distance at this point. He intended to open the door to take a look, but the children kept calling from a distance. So for some reason he ran towards them unintentionally. Yang, on the other hand, felt nothing out of the ordinary and simply inquired as to why they were staying out so late. They didn't mean to keep it a secret from him. They said they died a few years ago. That surprised Yang. They claimed that someone kidnapped, murdered, and buried them under this tree, and they wanted Yang to save them. Hearing this, Yang sat down unconsciously, began digging, and then couldn't remember anything. After all, Yang wasn't afraid, and he still wanted his parents to save the children. Yang's parents were perplexed by this. They exchanged glances but said nothing. It was difficult to believe, but everything that happened tonight made them concerned a lot. They put Yang to sleep, intended to solve the problem tomorrow. The next day, Yang's father asked his village neighbors to dig up the soil beneath the tree, and as Yang stated, they had only dug a little when a skeleton was discovered beneath the mud and soil. After digging was completed, 3 sets of small skeletons were discovered beneath the tree. They immediately reported it to the police and clarified everything. According to Yang, they caught the killers. They were the girl's uncle and aunt. 2 years ago, due to a lack of money, they lured the girl to invite 2 more friends over to play, and then arrested all 3 children. Someone wanted to buy them for a high price, so they loaded the 3 children into the trunk and began transporting them. They pulled over in the middle of the road to rest and also opened the trunk to inspect the children's situation. The children couldn't stand the distance and the heat of the summer, so they suffocated and died. They didn't know what to do at the time. so they dug a hole in the ground and buried the children's bodies there. Yang's grandmother died a long time ago, and Yang's parents also rarely visited, so almost no one knew about this. But they would never know. Evil deeds would be discovered. The children had been waiting for Yang for a long time. They knew that they would be saved. I grew up in a poor village. Back in the days, most of the roads were in such bad condition that it took us a pretty long time to get to school. For the sake of our education, we attended boarding school as it would be more convenient for us. First day going to school, each of us was handed a set of pillows and blankets to take to our dormitory. As soon as we went to our dorm, we all together cleaned up the room, wiped the dust off the wall and rearranged our stuff. Jack, one of my 3 roommates, discovered a large window in the room. He joyfully opened it to have some morning sunlight in the room and told all of us to come check it out. The window overlooked the school backyard and a dense forest with very tall pines. That night, after we finished our outdoor class meeting time, we quickly got back to our room. Me and another 2 friends of mine decided to play poker for the night, while Leo was sitting at the table studying. He was the most diligent student in our group. It looked like Jack was bitter over losing the game to me, so he asked nerdy Leo to join us. But Leo refused it right away, saying he was busy doing some school assignments in the hope of getting a scholarship. We kept playing the game, yet talked quietly as we didn't want to bother him. We kept playing poker until midnight and then went to our beds. Leo was still sitting at the desk behind the window doing his assignments. As he wanted to take a look outside for getting more ideas, he gently pulled the curtains aside. It was unknown to us what he had witnessed, yet he let out a loud scream which awoke us immediately. The 3 of us got off our beds. We rubbed our eyes, then walked to Leo to check on him. We were wide awake as we saw the things appear in front of our eyes. They were truly beyond imagination. There were blue balls of flame outside the forest. They were igniting and floating in mid-air, looking creepy. While gazing at the blue flames outside the window, Ken asked in amazement, "Guys, what the hell are those things?" Jack replied, "Aren't they spook lights?" The atmosphere inside the room got tense. It became even heavier when nerdy Leo said it was just some kind of natural phenomena, and we strongly disagreed with him. Ken told us to stop quarreling and suggested us going back to bed as it was already late. The 4 of us went to our beds and slept until late in the next morning. During the lunch break, we gathered around and discussed about the blue flames we had seen last night. Then came up with a plan to discover the forest behind our school. I also took this opportunity to tell them about the rumors about those blue flames. People said there were ghosts in the forest. Out of curiosity, the whole group set out to the forest, as we decided to climb over the fence, then make our way to the destination. We successfully made it outside without being recognized, as the teachers and everyone must have been taking their naps. We curiously went deep into the forest as we walked past the tall pines. From inside the forest was way more beautiful than we'd expected. Briefly looking around, we saw nothing abnormal about the place. Suddenly, nerdy Leo loudly yelled, "Hey guys, come take a look!" He pointed out the white bones scattered and plunged into the ground. None of us had any idea how long these bones had been here. Even more terrifying, near the spot where Leo was standing, we quickly found other bones behind the trees. As we were standing in bewilderment, Leo turned away, searching for a spot to urinate. But Ken stopped him from being away from the group as he feared his friend would get lost or encounter something bad on the way. So we decided to follow Leo in case any unexpected incident happened. As Leo was taking a few steps, he tripped and fell into a large hole. Leo screamed in horror. His lower body was stuck inside the hole. He couldn't move at all, as if there was someone underneath him trying to pull him down. We struggled to pull Leo out of the hole as he was scared and in pain. As we finally removed Leo completely from the deep hole, his face was pale. He even had tears on his eyes due to being scared. Leo pointed at his legs, speaking incoherently. Turned out that one of his legs was stuck inside a human skull. How terrifying that there were many dead people buried in this forest. The appearance of the skull also made the atmosphere more intense than ever. Ken almost peed his pants. He said, "What the hell is going on?" Leo panicked as he realized how serious the situation had become. I suggested the group to bring the skull back to the hole and then get back to our room. All of us were scared after the trip. We climbed over the fence and headed to our dorm, then laid on our beds and covered ourselves with blankets. None of us talked to each other as we were still haunted with the things we'd seen at the forest. As we expected, nothing bad would happen to us. Another spooky thing took place. This time, it was way more scary than the things we saw the other night. As we were peacefully sleeping, Ken suddenly got up. He woke up Jack by shaking his shoulder. Jack confusedly looked around and not knowing what was going on. Meanwhile, I was scared to the point when my face had turned purple. I spoke to my friends in a trembling voice and I also heard strange noises. It seemed like we all realized that something creepy was taking place outside the window. Jack plucked up his courage. He got off his bed and walked to the window to check. He pulled the curtains aside and looked out of the window. Jack, suddenly startled, eyes glued to the window as he called us over to see what was going on outside. We didn't see the blue flames like we did the other night. Instead, there were white shadows hovering. They even emitted light which looked so scary to us. We immediately returned to our beds and pretended that we hadn't seen anything. I curled up with my blanket, shaking badly due to great fear. The next days, rumors about the blue balls of flame started spreading. The security guard had brought a dog and chained it at the school backyard to stop us from skipping classes by climbing over the fence. The first night, nothing spooky happened. However, the following nights we were constantly awakened by the dog's bark every time it struck midnight. Ken sat up. He called Jack, who was lying next to him, to go take a look at the window and see if there was anyone entering the school that made the dog bark so loudly. The two pulled the curtains aside and were scared by the scene before their eyes. The blue balls of flames appeared again. They floated around, and that was why the dog had barked so loudly. Its eyes were vicious. The dog growled aggressively while drool was oozing out of his mouth. It looked like the spook lights could feel the dog's aggression towards them. As the dog approached, they slowly moved backwards and disappeared into the forest. We couldn't get back to sleep as the dog was still barking loudly. We were all sleepless that night, while the lights in the teacher's room were on for the whole night. As the sun was about to rise, I heard noises of someone going in and out of the room, but I kept my eyes closed as I was scared of ghosts. The next morning, everybody was freaked out to find out that Nerdy Leo had disappeared. The uniforms he'd prepared for school last night were still placed neatly on the bed. As we left our room, we saw a crowd gathering at the restroom. Standing from afar watching, I suddenly had a bad premonition within me. The three of us looked at each other, wondering if Leo was in trouble. We tried to make our way through the crowd. As we finally got inside the restroom, Ken yelled out that it was Leo. Leo was sleeping in the toilet. He still had his pajamas on. His whole body was cold as he leaned against the wall unconsciously. But the strangest thing was, Leo's face had become noticeably ill-favored. It was gaunt and there were deep hollows underneath his cheekbones. We carried Leo to the infirmary. All of us believed Leo being in this situation had a lot to do with the balls of flames we saw at the forest last night. Soon as we entered the infirmary, Leo was given a saline drip by the nurse. It was lucky that he just fainted. I heard the boy said that a few minutes later Leo suddenly sat up in a state of panic. We asked him about what happened and were told a story that was beyond our imagination. Last night, as Leo was on his way to the restroom, he had encountered a ghost coming towards him from the end of the corridor. As Leo was being sleepy, he accidentally bumped into the ghost, which fully awoke him. Leo opened his eyes and looked up. He was terrified by the scene before his eyes. It was a horrifying scene that could stay in one's mind forever if they saw it. The face of the man standing in front of him was completely disfigured. His facial skin was cracked. His mouth was wide open without any tooth inside. Panicked, Leo fell backwards and accidentally bumped his head on the wall, then fainted. After the incident, Leo asked for a few days off from school so he could have time to recover. That night, as everyone was sleeping, Jack was again awoken by the dog's loud barks. This time the dog became even more aggressive as he barked louder and louder, which caused Jack to be scared. All three of us went to the window, pulled the curtains aside and turned our gaze at the forest and the school backyard. We were soon freaked out by the reappearance of the blue balls of flames. This time there were more of them coming to our direction. The balls formed the circle surrounding the pitiful dog. A while later it looked like those balls of flames had absorbed the dog's soul as he slowly contracted and fainted. We were heartbroken to witness the scene. Perhaps Leo had dealt with the same situation that day. We were sleepless that night. As the sun came up, the school security guard were freaked out to find the dog died, freezing on the yard, without any apparent reason. We and the other students curiously went to check on the dog. Every one of us was scared and upset by the scene in front of us. The dog had died freezing, all of his limbs held up high. We didn't expect those spooky lights to be so brutal and horrifying. We later found out that the school and its dormitory area were built on a mass grave back in the wartime. No longer after the incident, our school was sealed up and later ended up being dissolved. We moved into another boarding school which was far away from our old one. Our old school had been abandoned ever since, and yet there were still rumors about the ghosts and, of course, the spooky lights.
My elementary school teacher was a person who didn't believe in ghosts, but that year, something terrible happened that made him start to change his mind. The school I attended at the time was small in the village. In the past, the school was even more rickety and shabby, but then with donations from everyone, it was also more spacious. My teacher's name was Zhang. He was always busy and dedicated to his work. That day, he stayed at the office very late to prepare the outline for the following day. As soon as it was all over, he was able to relax his body and stretch his shoulders. Then suddenly he heard a noise coming from the window. It was like someone was walking back and forth in the schoolyard and throwing sand into the room. He listened to hear better, then noticed that the noise was getting louder and louder. The more he heard it, the more it sounded like someone was moving the sand outside. Thinking that there were still some boarding students playing outside at this hour, he slowly approached the door to have a look. Strangely, when he opened the door, there was no one outside. Everything was still extremely quiet. Muttering a few words, he went back inside. He thought partly because he heard it wrong or just normal wind. So he quickly sat down at the table to prepare to continue working. But as soon as he sat down on the chair, the same noise started again. This time the sound was louder than before. At this point, he thought that someone was trying to make fun of him, so he went quickly and opened the door with a few scolding sentences. But it was still like at first. Everything was extremely silent outside, not even wind. Even that day the weather was hotter than usual. This thing made him start to wonder and be confused. He closed the door to go inside, but thought about the sound in his mind. But being a person who did not believe in ghosts, he still did not think much. Then he continued to sit at the table and drafted the outline for the rest. The noise was again heard outside the courtyard, this time more clearly and longer than the previous two, but he chose not to care about it anymore. Whatever it was, just didn't care. So he sat at the table and finished all his work without going out to the yard to check it out. After the work was done, it was already past midnight. There would always be boarding rooms for teachers to stay at the school. Since it was late at night and he still had to get up early tomorrow, he decided to stay in the teacher's boarding room. He also forgot that the strange noise from outside was no longer heard. He thought that someone must have known he was late and wanted to scare him, but they stopped when they got bored. At this moment, cold air rushed in from the door, surprising him, so he quickly looked out. The window was still closed, but there was a figure outside the door. Because it was too dark, the face could not be seen clearly. It seemed to be a man. That man was standing close to the window and staring at Mr. Zhang. Too surprised because suddenly at this time a stranger was standing outside the door looking at him, Mr. Zhang immediately ran to the door, thinking that the man had been teasing him by pretending to be a ghost. So Mr. Zhang was very angry. However, when he opened the door and looked at the window, the man had disappeared from time to time. Seeing that, Zhang was also confused as to what was going on. He shouted to ask if anyone was here teasing him, but everything remained silent. At this moment, he was also a little worried and felt strange. Maybe it was a ghost. Otherwise, how could it disappear so quickly? Besides, the school had never had strangers enter. But feeling that nothing happened, he quickly changed his clothes and went to bed because the following day was an important class. As soon as he lay down on the bed, Mr. Zhang began to hear the sound of sand pulling, footsteps and noise in the yard. It was louder and more chaotic than he first heard. Curious, he began to put his glasses on and listen carefully again, just afraid that he heard the wrong steps. And when he came up, there was no one like before. But the footsteps became louder and clearer. Certainly not by mistake. Mr. Zhang slowly got out of bed and put on his slippers. This time, he would be gentle, so that if someone teases, they would not be able to run in time. But when he looked out at the yard through the glass window, the things outside made him terrified. Many people were walking outside, or rather the whole yard was full of people. Suddenly in the middle of the yard, he didn't know the graves. How could it be grown so quickly? Countless graves appeared all over the schoolyard. Fearing that he might have misjudged his vision due to fatigue or because he was in a dream, he carefully took off his glasses and wiped them carefully to see again. This time, it was unmistakable. No one made fun of him at all. He must have met a ghost. The schoolyard was now littered with graves and monstrous people. Their gazes were contorted and their white eyes had no irises. Some people even looked like they had sores, which were very scary. Suddenly one of them discovered Mr. Zhang peeking from inside the room. That freaked him out. Mr. Zhang tried to cover his mouth and nose with both hands. He was afraid that even breathing lightly would be discovered by all those ghostly people. But it was too late. As soon as he covered his mouth, they also discovered him. So they turned all their attention to him. These people were so monstrous, even their heads were bent backwards as if broken. Their heads were hanging and looked terrible. After that, they gathered together and approached Mr. Zhang's room. More and more people flocked to the door of the room. They stood outside the glass door and looked inside. Only now could their faces be seen clearly. Some people had their entire faces destroyed. People had broken limbs. People had broken necks. People had blood all over their faces. The scene couldn't be more terrifying. Mr. Zhang was so scared that he fell backward. His legs were frozen, unable to move. They jostled and jostled each other, then pressed their faces to the glass as if they were watching something interesting, thinking they could rush into the room at any moment. Terrified, Mr. Zhang could only try and let out a scream when he passed out. What happened after that? Mr. Zhang didn't know anything anymore. The following morning, the other teachers came and found that Mr. Zhang had fainted on the ground, so they took him to the infirmary. He was finally able to wake up and still be at peace. After he calmed down, he also recounted everything that happened last night. After hearing the story, everyone suddenly remembered that this school was built on the land of a mass grave. There used to be a lot of strange things happening here. After that incident, the school invited a Feng Shui master to review the school, and the Feng Shui master proposed to build a large stone board in the middle of the schoolyard as a cover. And it worked. After building that stele, everything continued to go on as usual. No one was scared anymore.